My husband looked me straight in the eyes, smiled like he'd already won, and said, "You'll never make it without me." Less than 2 years later, I was signing papers that made me wealthier than he could ever imagine, while he stood outside my office begging for just 5 minutes of my time. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Please stick with me because this story keeps getting more unbelievable with every chapter. My name is Alara Quinn, and I always believed marriage was built on trust, loyalty, and supporting each other through every challenge. My husband, Nolan Pierce, saw things differently. The more successful he became, the more he treated my dreams like they were meaningless. Every time I talked about starting my own business or taking a career risk, he laughed and reminded me that everything we had existed because of him. Eventually, I started questioning my own abilities. The final blow came during a dinner celebrating his promotion to another city. Without discussing it with me, Nolan proudly announced he was moving alone because I would only slow him down. In front of friends and co-workers, he handed me divorce papers as if ending our marriage were just another business decision. Then he leaned close and whispered, "You'll never make it without me." I left that restaurant carrying one small suitcase, devastated but determined. I had no idea that losing the man I loved was about to become the turning point that changed my entire life forever. After leaving my marriage behind, I rented the smallest apartment I could afford. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The silence felt strange at first, and every unpaid bill reminded me how uncertain my future had become. I applied for dozens of jobs, hoping someone would give me a chance, but rejection after rejection slowly chipped away at the confidence I was trying to rebuild. Whenever another opportunity slipped away, Nolan's words echoed in my mind, "You'll never make it without me." There were nights when I wondered if he had been right, but I refused to let those thoughts define my future. Since full-time work wasn't coming, I accepted temporary consulting projects, helping struggling small businesses organize their finances and reduce unnecessary expenses. The work wasn't glamorous, but I treated every client with complete dedication. I believed that if I couldn't find the perfect opportunity, I would create one through consistency and hard work. One afternoon, a client introduced me to a retired investor named Graham Holt. He asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to my ideas, and challenged my recommendations. Instead of dismissing my opinions, he seemed genuinely impressed by how I identified opportunities hidden inside failing businesses. After several meetings, Graham surprised me with an offer to work alongside him, reviewing investments and advising on acquisitions. He made one thing very clear. He wasn't offering me a chance because he felt sorry for a recently divorced woman. He wanted me on his team because he trusted my judgment. For the first time in years, someone saw my abilities instead of my past, and that single moment gave me more confidence than I had felt in a very long time. Working alongside Graham changed my life in ways I never expected. Instead of chasing quick profits or popular trends, we spent our time studying businesses that most investors ignored. Graham encouraged me to trust my instincts, and I quickly discovered that my greatest strength was recognizing potential where others only saw failure. We invested in small technology startups with innovative ideas and manufacturing companies that had solid products but poor financial management. I looked beyond impressive presentations and focused on honest founders who were willing to work hard and think long-term. One investment succeeded, then another, and soon our portfolio began growing faster than anyone had predicted. Every successful decision helped rebuild the confidence I had lost during my marriage. For the first time, I wasn't trying to prove Nolan wrong. I was proving to myself that I had always been capable. As our investments expanded, Graham suggested keeping my identity private. I agreed because I wanted every business decision to stand on its own merits, not be influenced by my personal story or growing reputation. While other investors sought attention and public recognition, I stayed behind the scenes, letting the results speak for themselves. Before long, people in the business world began talking about an anonymous investor whose funding seemed to rescue companies others had already written off. The mystery attracted endless speculation, but no one knew who was making the decisions. Meanwhile, Nolan occasionally heard those same rumors during meetings with colleagues. He admired the unknown investor's remarkable success and wondered who could be changing so many businesses. The thought that the mysterious financier could be his former wife never crossed his mind, because he still believed Alara had disappeared into an ordinary life after their divorce. Life moved on for Nolan much faster than it did for me. Only months after our divorce, he married an ambitious attorney named Celeste Rowan. From the outside, they looked like the perfect power couple. They attended exclusive dinners, charity galas, and private networking events, always surrounded by influential people. Their marriage seemed built on prestige, expensive lifestyles, and carefully maintained appearances. Everyone admired them, but very few knew what was happening once the cameras were gone and the doors were closed. While Nolan focused on protecting his reputation, his company was quietly slipping into trouble. Confident that bigger always meant better, he approved several risky expansions without fully understanding the financial consequences. The projects drained company resources, profits began shrinking, and debt continued growing. Instead of accepting responsibility, Nolan blamed managers, employees, and changing market conditions. Every failed quarter became someone else's fault, and every meeting ended with demands for quick solutions instead of thoughtful decisions. As the pressure increased, Nolan became desperate to find investors willing to inject fresh capital into the struggling business. He attended conferences, arranged private meetings, and contacted financial firms across the country, convinced that one major investment would solve everything. He never stopped believing he could fix the company with the right connection. At the same time, he remained completely certain that I had settled into a quiet, ordinary life after our divorce. In his mind, I had simply faded into the background, exactly as he had predicted. He had no idea I was building something far greater than he could imagine, and that our paths were slowly moving toward an unexpected reunion neither of us could avoid. The years passed faster than I ever imagined. What began as a handful of careful investments gradually grew into a respected investment firm with projects across the country. We expanded one successful partnership at a time, earning the trust of business owners who valued honesty over empty promises. Despite the company's growth, I remained completely committed to protecting my privacy. I rarely attended conferences, interviews, or award ceremonies. When public appearances were necessary, my partners represented the firm while I stayed focused on the work behind the scenes. Graham often laughed and told me I had become one of the most influential people that almost nobody could recognize in a crowded room. He admired my decision to let results speak louder than publicity. I never wanted attention. I only wanted to build something meaningful that couldn't be taken away by someone else's opinion. Financial success gave me freedom, but it didn't erase every memory. I still remembered the embarrassment of sitting in that restaurant while Nolan ended our marriage as though I had never mattered. His words had once convinced me I wasn't capable of standing on my own. Looking back, I realized they had revealed more about his arrogance than my potential. People sometimes assumed I worked so hard because I wanted revenge. The truth was much simpler. I wasn't trying to prove Nolan wrong anymore. I was creating a future where no one would ever have the power to define my worth again. Every business we helped succeed, every employee whose job was saved, and every honest entrepreneur we supported reminded me that real success wasn't about recognition. It was about building a life based on confidence, purpose, and self-respect that no one could ever take away. One morning, Graham walked into my office holding an invitation to one of the country's most respected business summits. Several struggling corporations would be meeting with investors to secure emergency financing, and our firm had been invited to lead the negotiations. Graham placed the invitation on my desk with a smile and said the final decisions belonged to me. Although he could represent the company publicly, he believed the person making the investments should be present when the most important discussions took place. As I reviewed the list of companies requesting funding, my attention stopped on one familiar name. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Nolan's company listed among the businesses desperately seeking financial support. For a moment, years of painful memories rushed back. I remembered the divorce papers, the humiliation, and the quiet confidence with which he told me I would never succeed without him. Graham noticed the change in my expression and quietly asked whether I wanted to decline the invitation. He assured me no one would question the decision if I preferred to stay away. I sat silently for several moments before closing the folder. Then I looked at him and calmly said that business should never be controlled by personal emotions. If I wanted to be the leader I had worked so hard to become, I couldn't allow my past to influence professional decisions. I agreed to attend the summit under the same confidential arrangement we had always used. My identity would remain private, and Graham would continue serving as the public face of our firm until the proper moment. Neither of us realized that this meeting would change far more than a single business deal. The business summit was filled with executives, investors, and company leaders from across the country. I arrived early with Graham and quietly took my place in the private meeting area reserved for our investment team. Because of our confidentiality policy, only a few organizers knew my role. Most attendees assumed Graham was leading every decision while I remained just another executive reviewing documents. Not long after the event began, I saw Nolan for the first time in years. He walked through the conference hall carrying folders and greeting potential investors with practiced confidence. Several times he passed only a few feet away from me, yet he never recognized the woman standing among the decision-makers. The timid wife he remembered no longer existed. Years of experience, responsibility, and quiet success had changed far more than my appearance. I carried myself with a confidence he had never allowed me to have during our marriage. Later that afternoon, Nolan entered our private meeting to present his company's proposal. He spoke with determination, explaining why his business deserved emergency financing and promising impressive returns if investors supported his expansion plans. As he answered questions from the executives around the table, I remained silent, carefully reviewing every financial report and contract in front of me. The deeper the discussion went, the more obvious the weaknesses became. Revenue projections were unrealistic, debt levels were rising, and several important risks had been overlooked. Other executives challenged his assumptions with direct questions, forcing him to defend decisions that clearly lacked careful planning. Throughout the meeting, Nolan worked desperately to convince the investment team to save his struggling company, never realizing the person with the final authority was the same woman he once abandoned without a second thought. The presentation finally came to an end, and the room grew quiet as the legal team prepared the final documents. Before any financing agreement could move forward, the lead investor was required to review the terms and sign in person. Until that moment, everyone except a handful of people believed Graham was the firm's decision-maker. He calmly gathered the paperwork, then looked across the table at me with a small nod. I stood, walked to the head of the table, and removed the confidentiality cover that had concealed my identity throughout the negotiations. Every conversation in the room stopped. I introduced myself as Alara Quinn, the founder and majority owner of the investment group responsible for every final decision. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. Nolan looked at me as though he had forgotten how to breathe. His expression shifted from confusion to complete disbelief. He searched my face, trying to understand how the woman he had dismissed years earlier was now standing in front of him with the authority to determine his company's future. Graham broke the silence by addressing me with the same respect he had always shown. He asked whether I was satisfied with the financial review and ready to make the final decision. Every executive at the table immediately turned their attention toward me, waiting for my response. No one questioned who was truly in charge anymore. At that moment, reality finally caught up with Nolan. The woman he once claimed would never succeed without him had quietly built an investment empire powerful enough to decide whether his struggling company survived or collapsed. For the first time since our divorce, he understood exactly how wrong he had been. The meeting ended without a final commitment, and I quietly gathered my documents before leaving the conference room. I had barely reached the hallway when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Nolan called my name with a voice I hadn't heard in years. When I turned around, the confidence he had carried throughout the conference was gone. He looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperate. He apologized again and again, admitting he had made terrible mistakes during our marriage. He said he had been arrogant, too focused on his own success, and blind to everything I had contributed. Then he surprised me by claiming he had always believed I was intelligent and capable deep down. According to him, he had simply failed to show it. Finally, he asked if we could start over, not just professionally but personally, hoping I would give him another chance. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I calmly reminded him of the night he handed me the divorce papers. I repeated his exact words back to him, "You'll never make it without me." I told him those weren't the words of someone who believed in me. They were the words of someone determined to make another person feel small. I explained that real support isn't offered after success becomes impossible to ignore. It is given during the difficult moments, when someone is uncertain, struggling, and needs encouragement the most. That's when loyalty has value. Nolan lowered his head, unable to argue. For the first time, he fully understood that sincere regret could acknowledge the past, but it could never erase years of disrespect, humiliation, and the choices that had permanently changed both of our lives. The following morning, I returned to the conference with a clear mind and one responsibility: to make the best decision for our firm. My personal history with Nolan had no place in the financial review. Together with my team, I examined every report, contract, and projection his company had submitted. The deeper we looked, the more concerning the picture became. Years of reckless expansion had created overwhelming debt. Several liabilities had been minimized in the reports, and projected earnings depended on unrealistic assumptions rather than solid performance. Promises had been made to previous lenders that were never fully honored, leaving serious questions about the company's long-term stability. After discussing every detail with Graham and the other executives, I reached my conclusion. When the meeting began, I thanked Nolan for presenting his proposal and acknowledged the effort his team had invested. Then I calmly explained that our firm would not be moving forward with the investment. My voice never rose, and I showed no anger or satisfaction. This decision had nothing to do with our past. It was based entirely on the financial facts placed before us. The room remained quiet as I outlined the risks and explained why approving the funding would be irresponsible. Several investors who had been undecided reviewed the same evidence and reached similar conclusions. One by one, they also withdrew their interest, leaving Nolan without the financial support he had counted on. For years, Nolan believed confidence alone could overcome poor decisions. Now he faced a different reality. Reputation could not replace accountability, and charm could not erase financial mistakes. For the first time, he learned that the business world rewarded discipline and responsibility, not arrogance or empty promises. Without the investment his company desperately needed, Nolan had no choice but to begin restructuring. Projects were cancelled, expansion plans were abandoned, and every department faced difficult budget cuts. Creditors demanded answers, suppliers tightened their terms, and months of financial pressure finally caught up with him. The comfortable life he had built on appearances started disappearing piece by piece. The luxury apartment was sold, expensive memberships were cancelled, and the lavish dinners that had once filled his calendar became distant memories. Everything he had worked so hard to display could no longer be maintained. The pressure reached his marriage as well. Celeste had always admired ambition and success, but as the financial problems grew impossible to ignore, her priorities became painfully clear. She had little interest in standing beside someone whose influence and wealth were fading. Arguments became constant, and before long, she decided to leave. The relationship that had once looked perfect from the outside quietly fell apart when the status that held it together disappeared. Nolan also noticed another painful change. The people who had once eagerly accepted his invitations suddenly became unavailable. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, and former business associates found reasons to keep their distance. The network he believed represented genuine friendship had largely existed because of what he could offer. For the first time in his life, Nolan was forced to face himself without wealth, prestige, or admiration to hide behind. He finally understood that money could attract attention, but it could never guarantee loyalty. Respect had to be earned through character, and commitment could not survive if it depended only on success. Those lessons arrived far too late to repair the life he had already lost. As my company continued to grow, I found myself thinking less about profits and more about purpose. Financial success had given me opportunities one once believed were impossible, and I wanted those opportunities to reach people who simply needed someone to believe in them. We created scholarship programs for young entrepreneurs with strong ideas but limited resources, helping them gain the education, guidance, and funding needed to build their own businesses. Watching their confidence grow reminded me of the encouragement Graham had given me when I needed it most. I also began quietly mentoring women who were rebuilding their lives after divorce, job loss, or serious financial setbacks. Many of them doubted themselves just as I once had. Instead of giving them easy answers, I shared practical advice, listened to their concerns, and reminded them that difficult chapters did not have to define the rest of their lives. Seeing them succeed became one of the most rewarding parts of my journey. Graham often told people that my greatest achievement wasn't the size of the company or the value of its investments. He believed my real success was measured by the number of lives changed because someone had been given another chance. Hearing those words meant more to me than any business award ever could. Looking back, I realized the end of my marriage had not destroyed my future. It had redirected it. The heartbreak I once thought would break me had become the reason I understood resilience, compassion, and determination so deeply. What began with disappointment had grown into something far greater than personal success. It became the foundation for helping countless others discover that setbacks can become the beginning of an entirely new and meaningful life. Several months after the conference, I received a short message from Nolan asking if we could meet one last time. There was no mention of business, investments, or financial help. His request was simple, and after giving it some thought, I agreed. We met at a quiet coffee shop where there were no boardrooms, contracts, or expectations waiting between us. It felt strange seeing him again after everything that had happened, but this time neither of us carried the same emotions we once had. Nolan spoke first. He admitted that losing me had been the greatest mistake of his life. Looking back, he finally understood how often he had dismissed my ideas, ignored my feelings, and confused control with leadership. He said he had spent years believing success came from status and recognition, only to realize those things meant very little without someone genuine to share them with. He wasn't asking me to return or change the past. He simply wanted me to know he accepted responsibility for the choices that had ended our marriage. I thanked him for his honesty because sincere accountability deserves respect. Then I gently explained that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. I had forgiven him long ago, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let bitterness shape my future. Still, I had built a life grounded in confidence, independence, and self-respect, and I wasn't willing to leave that behind. When we stood to leave, there was no anger, resentment, or unfinished argument between us. We walked away in different directions, carrying lessons that neither of us would ever forget. Some endings cannot be rewritten, but they can still lead to peace and personal growth. Driving home after my final conversation with Nolan, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened since the day he looked me in the eyes and said I would never make it without him. At the time, those words felt like the end of my world. I believed I had lost my future along with my marriage. Looking back, I realized they had become the beginning of a completely different life, one I never would have discovered if I had stayed where I was. Over the years, I learned that real wealth isn't measured only by the balance in a bank account or the size of a business. It comes from believing in yourself even when no one else does, making decisions you can be proud of, and surrounding yourself with people who encourage your growth instead of limiting it. Graham believed in my potential long before the rest of the world noticed, and that kind of support changed everything. Nolan spent years chasing titles, influence, and the approval of people who disappeared when his success faded. In the process, he lost the person who had loved him without expecting anything in return. That was a lesson money could never erase. I also realized I had never needed revenge. Success quietly exposed every false assumption that had once been made about me. I didn't win because Nolan failed. I won because I refused to let his opinion become my identity. The greatest response to being underestimated wasn't anger or proving someone wrong overnight. It was building a meaningful life where their words no longer had any power. The woman who once walked away carrying a single suitcase had become someone no one could ever diminish again.